guys. Welcome to the Sua Sponte podcast. I'm Ken Harper, and today I'm with Tony Mayne. We're going to talk about his experience in the military and then what he's been doing since he's gotten out of the military. So, Tony, did you just want to go ahead and introduce the guys to your military career and what you did while you were in?
Hey, happy to, Ken. But first, I just want to say thank you for having me on. You know, it's a blessing anytime a veteran of any type gets to tell their story, and it's something we need to do a lot more of. So thank you for Sua Sponte podcast for providing that option. Very, very much so. So I was lucky enough to serve 20 years in the military. I came in after graduating from the Ohio State University into 3rd Ranger Battalion, went through RIP, not RASP. And so that was a much different 17-day experience than what the guys currently go through before they join the Ranger Regiment. Blessed to be at 3rd Ranger Battalion and join a great company and Charlie Company. 375 Charlie Company was just loaded with men that would end up being mentors with me for my military career and continued to this day in life. And so I joined in 99, which put me in PLDC during 9/11. So as we were getting a maintenance class over, pre-maintenance of vehicles, preventative maintenance of vehicles, we learned about 9/11, and the trajectory of my career changed after that. So I would go on to participate with Charlie Company in the mission on Objective Rhino, deploy once again to Afghanistan, and then once again for that initial invasion of Iraq before deciding to go green to gold, which was a transition out of the Army to go to Clemson to pick up a master's degree so I could get back in the fight as an infantry officer. It would take me about 8 years from the time I left regiment to get back in as an officer. Then went through another transition with a medical board, but I was able to stay in the Army. I just became the public affairs officer of the Ranger Regiment. And after that, I finished out my career 3 years in Ranger Regiment as a public affairs officer, and then 3 years at US SOCOM. So I had 8 deployments, a wealth of experience. Got to see our Ranger Regiment grow in professionalism with what it was able to do on a day-to-day basis and the interactions with all of our interagency partners. Just absolutely blessed to be a part of that organization.
And so during all those transitions, what were some things that kind of stood out to you or that maybe you learned? I mean, you had a lot of them, going from enlisted to being an officer to kind of med board in to transition into kind of a civilian liaison kind of position. What are some things that you dealt with?
Okay, that's a great question. It's the same thing that everybody's going to deal with. And that's why I'm in the kind of the role doing what I do now. It's the gap of not knowing, right? There is no one in the military, very few folks in the military come in with a civilian career first. Some do. Very few have ever transitioned out of the military, got back in, and then mentored people how to get out from inside our brown fence or from inside fatigues, right? It doesn't happen. So for me, the unknown, if we're doing MDMP, the first thing we do would have facts and assumptions. When you're getting out, there's a lot of facts in terms of programs, but you've never done them before. You've never done it yourself. So it's all assumptions. And assumptions make Rangers feel extremely uneasy. We train, we rehearse, right? Our training is harder generally, depending on the enemy in that particular night. Our training is generally harder than the operation itself, right? But there's no rehearsal for transition. It's your real life. And your leaders are focused on war fighting, not just on you. In fact, you might have found it, Ken, when you're getting ready to get out, you're given a lot more rope than you might have for a layout, right? You'll get more instructions for how to do a layout, an OCIE inspection or something like that, an arms room going down serial numbers. You'll get more instruction on that than you will how to get out, because that's not the job of the military. The job of the military is get people into a war fight. The fact that we even provide help in transition from the DoD perspective is really something that most organizations wouldn't think of doing.
Yeah. And well, for me, I did have a civilian job first. I did a couple years of college. I worked at UPS, and then I joined the military just because I ran into my own personal roadblocks at UPS with age and time there. So I was like, I'll leave for a couple years and then come back. And that was when I went to battalion. So I I had a shorter rope when I left because I knew, where and what I wanted to do afterwards, and I still had problems. So I can't imagine what it's like for a guy that's joins out of high school and has no clue. Um, so how did you get into? Well, I guess it was just a transition then that you went to Galleon Few in that liaison spot that you were in.
So where it started, I was the air officer for the regiment. I was going for a routine SRP. Now this is getting ready for all the things I needed to do before going to an assigned billet forward. I went through my hearing test, and I was automatically flagged and put into the medical board process. Now, for any ranger, this seems extremely weird to hear about hearing and medical board process, but it happened at a time where your pool score, that little score on the top right of your medical records, where they show profiles, it was like within months of it actually being the systems talking to each other electronically. So prior to, if you had bad hearing, you got something pistol whipped on a piece of paper, and it was like, hey, your hearing's bad. Take care of your hearing. Make sure you wear your hearing pro. I went through SRP. I sat in a booth, and then I had, I believe, a captain audiologist tell me, here's a piece of paper. Make sure you have to get it signed by your RHHC, first sergeant and company commander, saying that you're in the med board process. I had to go to the regimental assistant S3 and said, I can't deploy in 16 days. I mean, that was absolutely crushing. So when that happened to me, I'm at 14 and a half years. I'm a below the zone promotable to major. So my career was going well. I'm around great people. In terms of having to go through a med board and think about transition, programs aren't set up for folks like me back then. Right. Nor should they be, right? We care about the E4s, E5s, first time enlisters getting out. That's where the majority of the program should be. But what I thought about is, if I'm scared to death right now, and I've got a master's degree the military paid for, I've got plenty of recommendations, I've got plenty of operations, then how does the E4 or E5 feel? And so after being able to stay in the Army after the medical board, and becoming the public affairs officer, thanks to Colonel Chris Vanek deciding to keep me, which I am eternally grateful for. When we were in the PAO office, we thought about how could we internally message all of the groups and activities that are there to support Rangers. See, when I left Ranger Regiment enlisted and I go off to Clemson and I'm in the conventional forces, I spend my time on Facebook, on the computer, looking at how there's just this growth of organizations for SOF. And I'm starting to hear the names of Mike Hall that I had heard before, as when he was the regimental sergeant major when I was a HUA. I hear the names of Carl Monger. I see what folks like Sergeant Major retired Jeff Mellinger are doing, because I'm not in battalion and I just want to touch it. When I get back to the regimental headquarters and I'm wearing the tan beret, and I talk to my peers who are now at that time, back in 2014, are master sergeants and then become op sergeant majors as we put together the Ranger for Life policy. I realized that they've just been in the fight. They haven't been on Facebook trying to get back to Ranger Regiment. They've been in Ranger Regiment. So they don't know. Some of them, because they experience folks going through the CARE Coalition after buddies get shot, think the CARE Coalition at SOCOM exists only for folks who got injured in combat, which isn't, or wounded in combat, which isn't at all true. And I'm like, for the internal messaging part of being the PAO, we need to let the guys know that they're part of a team and an organization that goes beyond battalion, right? It's outside of the brown fence. Now, as a PAO, as we looked at that and then external messaging perspective, what was very interesting, when you look at the military, something very unique happened during the NCAA tournament. There is an Army recruiting ad utilizing West Point graduate, former Army officer, and a guy who's known as being the coach of Duke University, Mike Krzyzewski. It is the first time in recent history that I can remember that in an Army campaign or a DoD campaign for recruiting, they've used one of their alumni, Ken. Where's the power of the give back and the mental and intelligence, the support back to Ranger Regiment outside of the day-to-day? Where is it? It's in the alumni.
Yeah.
And we never use the alumni. Right? I would argue if we went back 10 years ago, the culture was, and we had this podcast software, we still wouldn't do it because that was the culture. And you look at it nowadays and the way Rangers generally handle themselves, everybody is now aligned that regiment is a good thing and it was a good part of my life and I want to share it. A decade ago, I don't think you saw that as much.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. You talked earlier about fundamentals and, well, not necessarily fundamentals, but just how we practice, how we train. And so I think that's been important for me my whole life in sports and everything is you train harder than, when you actually have to play in the game or anything. And so I think regiment takes that to the next level. But yeah, I don't think most guys, we don't talk about it. And to be honest, most guys in the big Army and everywhere else don't know about it. It's, because we're siloed off in a brown fence, everybody's like, what happens back there? What happens over there? And we get out and we only talk amongst each other. I mean, some of my best friends up here in Montana, prior Ranger guys, right? Stacy Roberts, he lives up in Kalispell, 375 Charlie guy. From the 80s, right? Like I was in from 2009. So, I mean, you're talking about a guy that was in 20, 30 years before me, and we're really good friends. And even my other buddy, he's in my church small group. He's a 275 guy. And but outside of those two guys, like I don't really talk military to anybody because it's foreign. And I feel like I have to explain so much to people about what regiment is that it's just not worth it. But recently we've had several guys commit suicide, and that's why we want to give people hope and a desire to see that like there's good jobs outside of leaving battalion, and I think you're a great example of somebody who had a lot of adversity and you still overcame it, through being med boarded out. I mean, that's a hard thing. And a lot of guys get med boarded out, especially out of battalion, because you're jumping out of planes and running hard and you get hurt.
Well, I would say I love what you're talking about in terms of your why. This is very passionate to you because of what some individuals have chosen to do. And so a big part of the evolution of Ranger for Life and why more Rangers are doing this. JC Glick, a very good friend of mine, he's been involved in so many veteran things, and he just took over as executive director of Commit Foundation. I never thought someone like Sergeant Major retired Mike Hall would be, I mean, for all intents and purposes, like I have like 5 best friends. I have 2 best friends since the military. One is my boss, Carl Monger, and the other one is Mike Hall. I never thought it's one thing to be a friend and an associate. It's another thing to be able to talk to Mike Hall 3 to 4 times a week and just enjoy it, And he's from Northern Ohio, so I've got a lot to make fun of him about being from Southern Ohio. But the passion of what you're doing is so important, and it's all about community, right? Yeah. We got to be very careful. And when you get you've had a regimental psychologist on. When you look at who we are generally introverts. Even if we present as extroverts, we're generally introverts, which means we will get our power source from being by ourselves. Which, if you don't have people to talk to and you have to be in a social setting explaining what you've done and why you're different from being in the military, you're more likely to withdraw. What I think a lot of folks are trying to do now within our community is ensure that we stay in community. And if we help in this transition phase, and our number one priority is to get young Rangers to talk to other Rangers of all different ages and backgrounds, that's what we're attacking. That's what we're building. we're taking introverts, trying to turn them not into extroverts, but into folks who know that they have a community on the outside. It will never be like battalion. It's not meant to be. It's probably not healthy for it to be as you get older too, by the way. But at the same time, right, that sense of community and that purpose and that drive and learning from other folks so you don't have to make the mistakes they made if you're just, humble enough to listen, that is pretty powerful stuff.
Well, and JC Glick, like you said before, he just took over Commit Foundation. And last week we had Mike Greenwood from Commit on here. And he talked a lot about what Commit's doing and the good things that they're providing for soldiers. And a lot of these foundations, you don't even hear about when you're ETSing. And me and Mike talked a lot about that, of taking 10 years to figure out what you want to do once you get out of the military. That's way too long. It just shouldn't. Maybe 3 to 5, but not 10. It's just, that's a long period of time to figure out what you want to do, especially when you're talking about a career that's only 20 or 30 years long, maybe.
Well, I think we got to take the same approach. There's a couple of different models, right? So when we created things that have become Ranger for Life and what's going on with Gallant Few, look at the models that are out there that kind of work. The college model. I speak about this often when I talk about what Ranger for Life is. I grew up in the great state of Ohio. When you grow up in Ohio, you generally like Ohio State. I mean, I'm talking majority of people, not everybody. Like, it's kind of a thing, it's a big deal, right? So as a sports kid and somebody who loved, watching everything on TV, and I used to kick field goals I kicked field goals in my backyard, beating Michigan like 80 times a day, right? I don't want to talk about the other 80 that I missed, but like that's what I did. We had this little, gosh, it's probably 8 foot tall, like not regulation, right? But I will tell you, I spent time in the backyard beating Michigan almost every day of my life, at least pretending to. So I wanted to go there, and then once you're there, they're already working on keeping you involved. Right? There's student alumni associations, there's groups, there's mentorship. Now, most colleges and universities, right, you have to do internships while you're in school. Like, they're ensuring there's a job after, because theoretically going to college is about getting a job, not just the experience, right? That's how colleges are rated, like how many of their graduates are employed after they get out. And then once you get out, like, who are the buildings named after? Active students? No, they're named after alumni who are successful. And who does the majority of recruiting outside of campus? They've got pockets, and the Alumni Association is set up nationally. Here in Columbus, Georgia, once a year, I go and represent Ohio State at a career fair. That stuck with me. Now, I then transition and I go to Clemson. So I go to a Southern school. And I see that they do it extremely similarly, actually a little bit better. Clemson has been in the top 4 in student satisfaction, and in the top 4 in percentage of alumni who give back to the university. So those two experiences made me realize, when I went to a regiment and was told by one of my senior leaders that I would never come back, because of course I was leaving, so I didn't have enough integrity to want to come back someday. Because once you're gone, you're dead to me, was the feeling at the time. And you compare that with what universities are trying to do. When we started presenting this Ranger for Life program, we were like, this is good for the regiment. Like, you and I should be 2 of the best recruiters for the Ranger Regiment. That should be a natural outcrop. Having this podcast, us talking about how our lives are better because of it. Yes, there were some challenges, natural challenges. That's recruiting.
But good challenges, great challenges, right? I mean,
Exactly.
Essentially, like, some of the challenges we had in battalion are what make us the men we are today.
Well, and that's why, because we're like, I don't want to say pre-regiment for everybody, right? But a Mount Yona, right? You might be able to look at a Mount Yona, or there's some study on the terrain, and say, I can't do that. I don't want to do that. Now our mentality the rest of our life is, that's going to suck. It's not that it's not going to get done. That's not even that's no longer a thing, because we can do anything that we put our mind to. We might find a unique solution to how to do it. But the whole difference between, like, not being able to say no to something, not and counting ourselves out, like, we generally don't do that. And we don't do that in community where there's accountability as well.
Yeah. So when we talked a couple weeks ago, or I guess it was a week and a half ago, you told me to read that book, The Blue Zones by Dan Gutner.
Did he do it? Did he get through some of it?
Yeah, no, I got it done. I mean,
it's a quick read, right?
I drive 10 hours a day, right? So I got plenty of time to listen to audiobooks.
Yeah, I forgot you read with your ears. That's
Yeah.
That's a good way to do it. Efficient.
So I hammered it out. But I wanted to ask you, like, what was your main premise behind it? I could tell you why I think you wanted me to listen to the book, but I was wondering what was your idea behind having me read that?
All right. One, we're Rangers. Data matters. All right. We're doing a lot of things in America right now based on feelings, with the idea that our feeling, if done correctly, will produce effects that we want, a better society, right? Whatever party you're on, right? And no offense, there's only two. I know there's this libertarian thing, but until they get their act together, right, and can be represented in every state, there's two parties.
Yeah.
Right. And they have an absolute inability to communicate clearly with folks based on data, because folks are taking feelings as being facts. So that book, Blue Zone, the idea that it looks at a place called the entire world, right, with the most complete data sets assembled to find predictable analysis of what will happen when you prioritize different variables in a society that work across different people groups. What that allows you to do is to look and listen to people and ask questions like, where did you get that from? And you now have a source with some of the best data in the studies in the back there, where you can call people out if they're wrong, right? Or you can ask them, well, where did you get that from? Because feelings and conjecture aren't good for anybody. We're kind of past that in the world, except in the United States, where we're kind of like devolving back into that because we don't like the truth.
Yeah.
Right. If I said, this is made up, but this would be like a data thing. If I said, if 9 out of 10 kids touch a light socket, don't die, but because of the shock, never do it again, versus 1 out of 10, or kids are told not to, and then one kid dies from putting a fork in the light socket, which one would you want? You'd want the one where like the nine kids nobody dies, right?
Yeah.
9 people would have had to experience pain, Ken.
Yeah.
And now we worry about that so much that we've kind of forgotten the common sense in our analysis of how things work. And so a place that was the melting pot where everybody who was different would become one, we're trying to be one nation where everybody's allowed to be different. And so Blue Zones in that book will talk about how things either happen naturally or with government action, either one can work, right? You may not like one over the other as an American when I say government action, but what were the results? And it was all based on ensuring people live together in community. It was all based on respecting people's religion, and not just respecting religion, but putting a premium on what we, a gallant few, would call spiritual fitness, right? Like used to be a thing, not disagreeing with people very loudly, telling them how they're wrong, right? But that ability to communicate, and that creates shared values, which is something that I think is rather evident. The things that we disagree about, that are loud about, that are causing divisions. I mean, we used to have somewhat of a value alignment in this country. The value alignment's not there anymore.
Yeah.
And then, of course, how can you get people to agree if they don't have the foundational alignment? But Blue Zones talks about how you can do it with government involvement and how it also evolves. And the results are what, Ken? Remember the results, the 3 things. You live longer, which theoretically people want to do.
Yeah.
You're healthier, which makes sense because you live longer. And in your life, you're happier.
Yeah.
Like those are 3 things. If you and I can put that in a bottle, like we win. forever. Right.
Yeah. And it's not that people live forever though. It's just that they live longer, better, happier lives in community.
In community, right? Like, because none of that talks about how it's an individual thing. In fact, the higher standard of living and the more wealth you have per capita, down goes those three items, except for some Scandinavian countries because of the value they place on how they do healthcare and whatnot. So anywho, that's why I wanted you to read it, because it will set the stage when we talk about Gallant Few and Ranger for Life, why we do what we do, why we value what we value, and things that seem as a very organic process are done for a reason.
Well, and I think that's one thing that has always been done in regiment is having the standards. And I would assume you had a blue book when you're in. I don't know. But that blue book, it tells you what it is to be a ranger. These are your standards. If you're not meeting them, you will be RFS'd. It's pretty cut and dry. And I think that that's one thing that sets us apart from the rest of the military is the fact that at any point, if you're not meeting the standard, you can be RFS'd from the regiment. And I think that's a good thing. I think we have problems with people at my current job that they're held into a position at work where they're not good at it. And really, as a society, if we force somebody to do a job that they're not good at, it hurts us and it hurts them. So for us to not fire somebody just because we don't want to hurt their feelings, it doesn't help anybody, because they're not being able to go out and seek their full potential in some other job they might be good at, because we're allowing them to stay in this job where they have subpar performance.
Amen. No doubt. And you mentioned standards in Ranger Regiment. As somebody who was in Ranger Regiment, a couple, I put on the tan beret on July 26, 2001, which was a very big deal until a couple months later, and 9/11 happened. And what people are saying, the standards are changing. I was also a public affairs officer when females were allowed to assess into the Ranger Regiment. And all I kept on hearing was the standards are changing. This is not Ranger Regiment. The standards are changing. The standards have and will always change. The standards will change to meet mission requirement and higher headquarter missions. The standards have always changed. What makes Ranger Regiment different is our accountability and adherence to the standards. So what you were talking about in the civilian world, right? That counseling program that does or does not exist, that is or isn't supposed to happen. Those types of things, more times than not, standards in the Ranger Regiment, adherence to them still matters. There are folks right now who come inside the brown fence and see people walking around without headgear, and they're just losing their damn mind, right? Well, that's the standard now. The standard changed. But that same dude, you don't want to compare him most likely to a guy from the 80s on the battlefield, because this new dude will crush you. These guys look like middle linebackers for the most part, right? And I'm not sure they can run as fast, but when they get there, like, there's a big thump coming. And that culture that they have now is no different than ours. And it is awesome to see.
Yeah, it's a progression. Mm-hmm. All right, Tony. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you talking about just your experience in regiment, your experience out of regiment, some of the things you went through, and I hope it helps anybody that's listening. And did you have any final thoughts, or is that?
Well, I think, Ken, once again, I thank you to the Sua Sponte podcast. What you're doing matters. It has effects. I know how hard this is to do, to try to take your civilian life and try to help others, because I know what ends up happening. That you end up probably getting a lot of extra questions and a lot of extra things that come from doing this. So thank you for taking that mantle of leadership within our community.
And like we always say, Rangers lead the way.
All the way.